And I'm going to use some of the stuff that I used in class for U.S. history this semester to give people a bit of a better understanding than my normal thing when I'm just reading off my list. So, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, born in 1911, died in 2004. He was born in a small village in Illinois called Tampico. His home doesn't exist anymore, but they do have this as their claim to fame. Now, where he's really going to grow up is a small town in Illinois called Dixon. And they make a big deal about this being the boyhood home of Ronald Reagan. And this is a picture of me visiting Dixon a couple years ago when I was on my way to Chicago. And Dixon, when Reagan's growing up, has around 8,000 people. It has about double that today, but it's a relatively small town. And he's going to be a college football player for Eureka College in Illinois. And the team is integrated. There are African-American players, and one of them is Franklin Burkhart. And so there's this story that they're on an away game, and the team's getting out of the bus. They're going to go to a hotel, but this hotel is not going to allow the African-American players to stay there. So the coach's idea is that they're just going to go, everyone's going to be in the bus. But Reagan realizes they're relatively close to where his parents live. So they're going to actually take the team and go, and they're going to all stay at his house. And this gets brought back up in the 1980s. Is that Ronald Reagan, when he sees something he considers unfair right in front of him, his tendency is to act. So he gets his first job in Davenport, Iowa, and he is doing radio commentary for Big Ten college games. Very quickly, though, he gets promoted. He gets a second job at WHO Radio in Des Moines, and he's doing the commentary on the Chicago Cubs games. And this actually takes a decent bit of skill because he's getting the information over the wire, right? And so it's very matter-of-fact, small little things going over the wire. And he's having to do color commentary as if he is there. Then he goes out to Hollywood in 1937. And what happens there is it's during the old studio system. So you don't go and audition for each individual movie and basically pick and choose. Right? You get picked by a studio, and then the studio picks you up for so many movies, and then they just tell you what movies to do. So he starts there, and he's put in all these different roles. And in 1938, he meets his wife, a fellow actor, Jane Wyman. And when they play opposite each other in this movie called Brother Rat. And so in 1940, they get married. They're going to have children. They're going to adopt a child too. And so they get married, have children. Now, Ronald Reagan's going to be the first president to get divorced. Okay? Like many Hollywood marriages, it does not last. So they get married in 1940. They get divorced in 1949. And so he is the first president to be divorced, one of only two presidents to ever be divorced during his time. Now, he's being an actor. World War II breaks out. And during World War II, there are a ton of actors that literally just leave their acting jobs and go and they fight in the war. Reagan does it a little bit differently. He's going to use his talents stateside, and he's going to be for the propaganda campaigns. And that sounds kind of negative, but that's what it was. It's for the war effort. You can find old propaganda movies that Ronald Reagan is narrating. He's using his acting skills to try to affect the war effort for the positive of the U.S. military. When the war is over, Reagan gets elected head of SAG, which is the Screen Actors Guild. This is the union that represents the actors in Hollywood. Last year, they went on strike, and this put a halt to a bunch of productions. And that's why a bunch of TV shows had less episodes this year. Movies got delayed. This is also during the time of the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism and the House Un-Americans Activity Committee. And so this is Reagan having to testify to them because there's all this fear of communism. And there are a lot of actors that lose their jobs. They get blacklisted during this time. And so there are some people that hold resentment for Reagan during this time, but also something that you have to think about, that Reagan was the head of a union. So in 1949, he had gotten divorced. And then in 1952, he married a woman called Nancy Davis, how we know as Nancy Reagan. And this is going to be a lasting marriage. It will last until he dies. And Reagan, in his earliest parts of politics, he was a registered Democrat. Okay, he'd been the head of a union. But Nancy Davis had always been a Republican. And at the time, this is kind of hard for modern people to wrap their heads around, California was a very Republican place. She basically told Reagan that if you want any chance of succeeding in politics here, you're going to have to be a Republican. And so in 1966, Ronald Reagan runs to be governor of California. And he wins, and beating Democrat Pat Brown. Now, 4 years before this, 1962, former Vice President Richard Nixon ran to be governor of California and narrowly lost to Pat Brown. So Reagan, 4 years later, coming in and winning is quite something. And so then 4 years later, he runs for re-election and he is re-elected. So he has a bit of a different background than a lot of presidents because he was a former Hollywood actor. But he didn't go straight from acting to the presidency. He was governor of the largest state in the country for 8 years. Now, in 1976, Ronald Reagan's going to run for president. He's going to primary Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was an accidental president. He was a replacement vice president that Nixon had to get through Congress after Spiro Agnew resigned, and then Richard Nixon had to resign over the Watergate scandal. So Ford became president, having never had to go through a primary or an election. And so Reagan's going to primary him, and he's going to primary Ford from the right. Ford is considered more moderate, and Reagan was going for the more conservative angle. And he gets close, but he is not successful at actually getting enough delegates to overcome Ford. It's very hard to unseat an incumbent president in a primary. Now, one thing he does do is he does affect Ford picks Bob Dole, a more conservative guy, as his running mate because he sees that Reagan has brought forth a weakness that he has with his group of voters. So Ford loses re-election to Jimmy Carter. And this means, though, that Reagan is basically the front runner in 1980 for the Republican nomination. Right. For this. And there's a bunch of people running in the Republican primary. But the two big ones that you're going to have to deal with is George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. And they're going to have a back and forth between one another. Now, Reagan kind of thinks that he can ignore the first state, Iowa, of the caucus, which is why Bush wins. But Reagan basically sweeps the rest, and he's going to become the Republican nominee. Now, in kind of a twist there, they got very close to asking Gerald Ford if he would come back and be vice president again. But ultimately, he ends up picking George H.W. Bush as his running mate. So this kind of consolidates the field, his main opponent, Reagan Bush. And he's up against Jimmy Carter. Right? And Jimmy Carter had his own issue because he has his own primary charge, Ted Kennedy. However, we have the situation where there was a third party candidate, John Anderson, okay, who was a more liberal Republican, had run as Congressman of Illinois. He couldn't get any traction in the Republican primary, so he ran as an independent. And Reagan can't get Carter to debate him, but he does get a debate with John Anderson, which gets covered by the major networks. And this kind of forces Carter to have to debate him. And part of the reason Carter didn't want to debate him was because all of Reagan's skills as an actor played better to the debate stage in a televised debate. These aren't the Lincoln Douglas debates that are about the merit of the argument. So, Carter actually had a lead for a lot of the time, but he gets dragged down. Reagan gets ahead, and it looks like it's really close to the end, but it ended up not being that close. Reagan wins. Reagan wins 44 states. And he makes inroads in the South that traditionally had voted for Democrats. And he has what we can call coattails. What do I mean by coattails? The Republicans take the Senate, right, for the first time since the 1950s. And so he's going to have a Democratic Congress, but a Republican Senate with him. Now, Reagan's going to actually have some issues early on in his term. His approval was rough for a while. Get as low as 35% in January of 1983, which was just a few months after the midterm elections, in which the Democrats gained a bunch of seats in Congress. And this is because there was a minor recession. This had basically fixed itself by the 1984 election. So Reagan's going to get easily renominated, and his opponent on the Democratic side is going to be Walter Mondale, the vice president for Jimmy Carter. And Mondale wants to kind of mix it up. So he picks a Geraldine Ferraro, a woman, as his running mate. So Reagan and Mondale debate. Reagan is typically thought of having won this debate pretty handily. When age is brought up, because he was oldest president up to this point, he said, "I will not make age an issue in this campaign." And pointing that his opponent's youth and inexperience. Right? He flipped on his head. Reagan wins a 49-state landslide re-election during this time. But topsy-turvy is the American electorate. 2 years later, the Democrats take back Congress, the Senate. All right, so that's like his electoral stuff. He has some really impressive electoral feats. But when he comes in to the presidency, right, there was this idea of the curse of Tippecanoe. This idea that presidents elected every 20 years experience a tragedy in office. Right? And this is an allusion to William Henry Harrison. So if you look at 1840, William Henry Harrison, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, all had died in office, several of them assassinated. So Reagan's going in, in 1980. is he going to continue this curse? And so we have John Hinckley Jr., okay, kind of deranged individual who thinks that he can impress an actress, Jodie Foster, by assassinating the President of the United States. And his focus really isn't just on Reagan. He thought about assassinating Carter, but couldn't get to Carter. So by this point, Reagan's president. And he's able to go get a gun, and he knows where Reagan's going to be. So Reagan's making a scheduled visit in Washington, D.C. on March 30th when he is shot. And there's several people that get shot. There's Secret Service members that are throwing their bodies over him. And he's sent to the hospital, and they're trying to get him saved. And there are people that die as the result of this. And this is Reagan, though, getting out of the hospital. And he's wearing this nice red sweater, and underneath is a bulletproof vest. So that happens at the beginning of his presidency. And John Hinckley Jr. was able to basically get away with the insanity defense and was in a psychiatric facility for a very long time. So when Reagan's coming into office, though, that's why some of his early popularity is the country kind of rallies around him because he just survived getting shot. Now, one thing that's going to really affect Reagan is he's going to have an enormous amount of effect on the judiciary. Ronald Reagan appointed 383 judges to the U.S. courts, and 11 of them are still serving today. So you look at the Supreme Court, he put on Sandra Day O'Connor. That was one of Reagan's campaign promises, is that he would put a woman on the Supreme Court. And so he nominated Sandra O'Connor, who was the first woman on the Supreme Court, as his first pick. Then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court died, and Reagan elevated an Associate Justice, William Rehnquist, to become Chief Justice. He's going to be Chief Justice in 2005. Okay. Senator O'Connor stays on the court until 2006. If she had not retired and stayed until she died, she would have been on to the court until last year. He puts Antonin Scalia on the court. He stayed on the court for another 30 years. President Trump got to pick Scalia's replacement. Now, one place where he kind of has a bad situation is he nominated Robert Bork, the former Solicitor General, who had been the guy, when we talked about this in class, was during the Saturday Night Massacre in Watergate. Nixon tells the Attorney General, fire the special prosecutor. He says no, so he gets fired. Tells the Deputy Attorney General, fire the special prosecutor. He says no, so he gets fired. Now, the Solicitor General's third in line, that's Robert Bork. He does the firing. And he can't really get rid of this stigma. And so he's denied a recommendation by the Judiciary Committee, and he loses on the House floor. But the Senate's not just being obstructionist for the sake of being obstructionist. He then puts up Anthony Kennedy, someone that's still alive, that just retired a few years ago, and he gets approved unanimously. So, on this legislative agenda for Reagan tax cuts. Okay. These are two separate bills to go through. But the 1981 bill cut the highest marginal tax rate from 70% to 50%. The 1986 bill cut the highest marginal tax rate from 50% to 38.5%. And the following year, it fell to 28%. So that's top marginal tax rate. That's not what you automatically are at. But for the money that you're making after your first $1 million in a year, it went from being taxed at 70% to 28.5% during Reagan's terms. The passage of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Reagan originally opposed the creation of this holiday under that it is costing the government money to give the workers the day off. but it passed very heavily in the House and the Senate, so Reagan signed it into law. Reagan signed the National Minimum Drinking Act, which tried to force every state to raise the drinking age to 21. So instead of just putting a law that says everyone has to put it to 21, it says you have to put it up to 21 or you lose 10% of your federal highway funding. If you're taking the Supreme Court upholds this. And this is how the federal government does a lot of things to try to force the states to do. So that's why the drinking age is 21. There's COBRA, Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And this is a healthcare thing where most people get their healthcare from their employer. And this means that if you're between jobs, you can have COBRA insurance, which keeps some coverage to you while you're looking for a new job, so that you don't just completely lose all healthcare if you're between jobs. The Firearm Owner Protection Act, this banned any new manufacturing of machine guns, but it grandfathered in people that made a machine gun purchase before 1986. He provided amnesty for illegal immigrants. This went through an act of Congress, but basically everyone before 1980 that had come here illegally got a pardon. Passed the Warren Act, which requires any decent-sized company to give a 60 calendar day advance notice before closing a plant or having a mass layoff of employees. He also signed reparations for Japanese Americans and apologized for what the United States did in World War II. And they all got $20,000 reparations. The other thing that Reagan's going to have to oversee is Challenger disaster. So NASA started doing the space shuttle program. And this is the idea for a reusable spaceship. The spaceships in the past had one-time uses, so it was quite expensive to keep on making new ones. So you start the space shuttle program, and they all have this type of name: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis. And they can go up and down and up and down. This is what I think about when I think about spaceships. So the Challenger had completed 9 missions safely. Right? 9 missions safely. Well, one of the things that NASA came up under Reagan was the Teacher in Space program. Okay, that a teacher would win a spot to go up into space, and then they could teach a lesson to students from space. And the person that wins this thing is Krista McAuliffe. And so she is trained to be an astronaut with the crew. And this is really pumped up. So you have kids in school watching this. And there's a bunch of warning signs that are missed on the day of. And it was not delayed. Nice on the rocket, which results in it exploding with millions of people watching. So Reagan has to console a nation. And I can't show actual Reagan video in this thing. And so I have Peggy Newton wrote the speech for him. They wrote there, he said, "I want to say something to the school children of America who are watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it is hard to understand, but it is sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future and will continue to follow them." So during Reagan's presidency, he develops Alzheimer's disease, becomes more pronounced in his second term, which means that he is less available in public life after his presidency. and he ultimately died in 2004. So, I hope you learned something about Ronald Reagan today. There's only so much I can fit in. Definitely an impactful president of the United States.